Madeline wanted to stare at him, but at the same time she didn't want to be subjected to another so-called punishment from Calhoun. The man was a master when it came to twisting and turning things that would turn to his advantage, and somewhere Madeline wished she had the art to do it too. This way she will be able to move forward with this man instead of falling into such circumstances. He didn't move his hands away from the wall, trapping her exactly where he wanted him while not caring a bit if any of the servants would find him and her like this. One of the maids had already come out of the kitchen, and despite Madeline's desire to stay away from him, Calhoun was having none of it. Then he moved his hands closer to her as if to close off the space she had in such a way that he invaded all of her space.
"What should I do with you now?"
Calhoun grunted.
"You said I can do anything I want. It's not every day I hear you say something like that for my benefit."
"You know I didn't mean it that way."
"Are you sure about that? Because from what I see and hear, the words that come out of your delicate lips, you want me to do things,"
said Calhoun, a wicked smile playing on his lips.
"I admitted to you that I was thirsty and you said I would do whatever I wanted. How nice of you,"
he whispered to her. Madeline, who had seen Sophie leaving this place a few minutes before, now wished she could re-enter to walk down the same corridor, hoping to get Calhoun to give her space. The man easily skipped some words and repeated only the words that suited him. "I'm not ready for this," she said as his face moved away from the front of hers and went to the side, and his lips fell next to her ear.
"Or are you saying that one day you will be? Am I looking forward to it?"
The question Calhoun spoke came into the shell of her ear. His words sent a shiver down her neck, and when Calhoun's eyes fell on her pale skin, the smile increased to show the fangs. He could hear her heart beating in her chest and skipped the beat of the music in his ears, the most beautiful melody with every breath she took in and out. He noticed them all as he had never seen any other woman before. Madeline bit her tongue. Every word she said did not turn in her favor. As such, she considered not to speak another word to him. But Calhoun was having none of it. He wanted to trick her, wanting her to make mistakes so he could use those mistakes to his advantage. He was not a saint, but a cunning person, and he used him like anyone else in the kingdom of Devon or any country. Another. He turned away from her as he grabbed her wrist. She didn't know what Calhoun wanted, or maybe she knew, but she wasn't ready to admit it because it frightened her. She felt herself being dragged away from the corridor. Calhoun's grip on her wrist was strong but not tight enough to break her skin as he dragged her through the hallways, Madeline following him. They crossed the corridors one by one and she didn't know where they were going. The castle itself was a maze that took a lot of time for a person to know where to go without having to return in the same place. Some of the walking servants stopped to bow their heads and let the king pass without looking at him. "Where are we going?" Madeline asked. Her heart started pounding because this was a place she didn't know or had never been here before.
"You will see."
Calhoun's calm and collected words came with a hint of mischief there that made her feel anxious as she followed the king. She moved her head left and right to notice the paintings hanging on the walls and the statues that were holding vases in their hands. When they came to stand in front of the two large doors, Calhoun opened them and entered a large room. Madeline noticed how large the room was, and in the middle sat a single bed with silk-like curtains around the bed bases. Her legs tensed at the thought of what he might do, because one misstep was completely innocent and Calhoun would turn her against her.
"Do you prefer the bed or do you prefer the sofa?"
Calhoun's question was enough to let a single drop of sweat slide down Madeline's back. Why, she asked him.
"Why do you think?"
he asked, his head tilted to the side, and the smile that was so wide before seemed tame but no less difficult. "Not when they were the only ones in the room," he ordered in a sharp, demanding voice.
"Choose one."
Madeline wondered if crying right now would get Calhoun off her back, but getting the tears out was difficult in the stressful situation she was in. She wanted to look at the man. Her expression was nothing but a mixture of emotions. She didn't know what he wanted from her. Calhoun's expression changed and he raised his brow as he took 2 steps away from her, giving her the space she wanted before he took it from her.
"Do you think it's right to keep your king waiting?"
he asked her. Madeline's hands clenched together and her eyes moved to look at the bed and then turned to look at the sofa. He added,
"I am thirsty."
Madeline realized why she was brought here. "You're going to take blood from me?" she asked him. Her head felt like she was ready to faint and she wondered if fainting was a good option, but he would know if she faked it. Doing something stupid was tantamount to demanding more punishment and committing to the ridiculous ideas he had in his head. As much much as she had heard scary stories about nocturnal creatures that drank blood from humans until they died, Madeline had to remind herself that it would be okay. It had only been 7 days since they had met each other for the first time. 7 days was 1 week, and that was all it took to lead them to where they were now. When Calhoun did not answer her obvious question, she grew more nervous and stormed off. "I said it's okay for you to drink from others. You can drink from them as much as you want and I won't mind." She closed her eyes, hoping he would listen to her plea. It felt like a nightmare. What sane person would court a girl he loved in this way? The next time she opened her eyes, Calhoun stood directly in front of her. She was not at the same distance before she closed her eyes. Madeline's heart nearly slipped out of her ribcage. She wondered if it was the king's other ability to move so quickly without a single sound, but then so were all predators. They first wandered towards their prey and then pounced on it. "I wouldn't consider it cheating if you were drinking from other women," she whispered, but Calhoun stared at her. Then Calhoun said,
"Will you choose one or will I choose one for you, because you are torn between which one to choose now?"
"There seems to be no way out of this. Take my blood." After a few days, after a month, I asked him to try to wiggle his way out of this situation. Who knew that maybe things would change, as he didn't want to drink from it at that time.
"Do you like bed?"
he asked her, ignoring her previous words. Madeline's eyes widened. "A sofa." Calhoun raised his hand and waved for her to walk over to the dark padded sofa. Madeline bit the inside of her cheek. A week ago she had happily dressed with her sister to attend mass at this time, but not once did she think that she would be at the castle a week later. This was because Madeline never longed for life in the castle, and it was probably because she was happy with what she had. She was someone who was happy wherever she was, and somewhere between the fleeting glances between her and James Heathcliff in the past she thought maybe it would lead to something more in the future. Everything was fine, she was satisfied, but here she was given more life than she had. He not only came with the luxurious status of the castle, with the luxurious clothes and jewels. She was not naive that there was more castle here. Even the walls held secrets. Her feet went towards the sofa, but she did not sit down. Her eyes fell on the number of pillows placed on the sides, and when her eyes turned to her left she noticed the stove that was burning with logs in it. When she heard the sound of Calhoun's shoes on the floor, she turned to see him walking over to where she was and sitting down comfortably on the couch. The coat he was wearing around his body was discarded, and this only set off the bells in her head. She wanted to ask why he was tormenting her with such actions, but at the same time she knew that his answer to her question would only bring him words that satisfied him, and she swallowed when he made eye contact. Then he raised his hand for you to take. She moved her hand towards him very carefully and trembled slightly as she placed it on his hand to feel him holding it with his large hand. He said,
"Sit down."
Madeline felt her head spinning. Even though nothing had happened, the tension she felt was enough to make her faint, and she prayed to be alive once it was done. She was about to sit down, but out of nowhere Calhoun pulled her hand so she could sit facing his body.
"Are you waiting for me to jump on you, and that's why you're slow? Don't make me wait,"
he said to her. His deep voice and his eyes staring at her were enough to make her freeze.
"I was going to choose the bed because it was more comfortable, but you were the one who chose the sofa."
He raised his hand forward to place it on the side of her face. Her eyes widened at his gesture towards her. It seemed like many of the horror stories she had heard from fellow villagers. Madeline's were the king's meal. Was she supposed to be happy because her life was offered to the king, a cruel man who had her where he wanted her? "I wanted neither," she replied, aware of his touch on her cold skin.
"We could have ignored both options then,"
he answered her. She wondered if he would do that to hear him say,
"There are things that don't need a sofa or bed. You will learn it soon."
Her lips twitched at the end, and Madeline continued to stare warily at him. Madeline wondered if Calhoun had ever been in love. She was curious, wondering if this was his first time, and the thought made her purse her lips.
"Today I will show you that you don't have to die when a creature of the night takes blood from humans."
Calhoun's words were meant to comfort Madeline, but she was someone who had never been bitten before. He issued the command,
"Relax."
I tried to listen to him. "Is human blood different?" I asked him. He answered her,
"Yes, some are good, some are not."
He ran his hand through her hair to smooth it out and tucked some hair behind her ear. Seeing Madeline opening and closing her lips, he said,
"What?"
The girl looked like a kitten who was ready to run out of the room at any moment, but Madeline knew better than to do that. Madeline had already talked about it. She had told him before, but she didn't know if he needed to remind him again or if he had just ignored her words. "This is not how you flirt with the person you love.
"Tell me how you think women want to be treated."
He was caressing her and giving her the time she needed to calm down so that her body would not stiffen. Madeline did not answer him. She did not want him to judge her. He murmured, looking at her,
"Very stubborn."
Then she said, "Drinking blood is no way to judge a person," Calhoun said.
Did you know that drinking blood is a very intimate act in vampire culture? I know we have a habit of taking blood from whatever we feel tastes good, but that's only until we find the right person.
The hand he never let go of, he brought her to his lap and ran his thumb over her wrist. The strokes on her skin were slow and created just enough pressure to keep her aware of his touch.
You think I'm harsh and impulsive, don't you?
Calhoun's eyes were on her wrist, looking at the veins and pale skin. "You haven't given me a reason not to think any other way." The king did not mind her words. Instead, he savored her words as she tried to contain her emotions and tried to be precise.
"I can't help but be next to you."
He laughed, and the smile only seemed to leave when his eyes turned back to look at her. The way he said those words shocked something, and she accepted that he accepted who he was without hiding it from her. Repeat.
"I'm a ruthless man, and if I don't understand things on my terms, I'm used to taking them by force. Sometimes a little pressure on external factors helps too, but don't worry, I will be patient with you regarding certain things so that you will not be afraid of me the way I want."
"But you want me to be afraid of you," she whispered as he raised her hand in the air with his own.
"That's what you believe, but that's not what I imagine it to be, sweet girl,"
he said, and leaned his face forward towards her wrist. He sank his fangs that felt like pricks. The pain was very subtle as she saw Calhoun sucking her blood from her wrist. She was surprised that he chose to draw blood from her hand and not from her neck, because she had heard how the nocturnal creatures found it easier to drink it. Calhoun's lips were on her skin and his eyes were closed as he felt like he was tasting every drop of blood that fell on his tongue. The anxiety, nervousness, and fear she had been carrying since entering this room seemed to have evaporated because it was not as scary as she had imagined. Like many people in the village, Madeline had never encountered a vampire night creature, and Calhoun was the first person she had ever met because of the party. Calhoun finally opened his eyes, which fell directly on her, and he used his tongue to lick the spot where he had bitten. Her face turned red at this action, and she quickly pulled her hand towards her and let go. Blood was dripping from the side of his mouth, and he used his thumb to wipe it away and lick it off by moving his tongue over it.
"Was it as terrifying as you thought it would be?"
He laughed. Because of the events that happened earlier, Madeline looked confused. Not that Calhoun took blood from her, but he used his rough tongue on her skin and then on his thumb, trying to entice her with a seductive look on his face. The room they were in was covered with curtains over the windows, leaving only a few of them open to view the world that was outside. Candles were burning in the chandelier that had been pulled toward the ceiling, and the fireplace where they sat glowed, the flames moving and rising in the silent room. Calhoun said,
"You are not a meal, Madeline. You are that dessert that one looks forward to eating even before the first and second courses of the meal are served, and I would like to be the only person who has the privilege of doing that. Be careful in the castle." He
warned her not to attract her attention as he leaned his back against the cushions of the sofa they were sitting on. She didn't have to be so careful if she didn't live in the castle in the first place, and gave him the look she had in mind.
"Danger is everywhere, not just here."
He rolled his eyes as if he had read what had passed through her mind.
"It's never a bad thing to be careful."
Madeline wondered why he said that, and asked, "I thought the castle was the safest place."
"It is both and not at the same time. Did you forget the poison?"
He reminded her, and she shook her head.
"If it weren't for me, I would be dead by now."
There was a smile on his lips staring at her. "If you hadn't made me stay here, this wouldn't have happened," Calhoun said, his eyes not leaving her.
"We would have wasted a lot of time if that were the case. Look at us now, sitting by the fireplace. I may be the villain in your book now, but I can't wait for the time when that changes."
Worse than a villain. Her words came out softly rather than forcefully, and Calhoun laughed. He ran his tongue over his teeth to rest on one of the fangs. Then he leaned close to her.
"I was going to say protagonist, but if that's what you want, we can do that too."
Madeline brought her hands closer to herself. "I don't think I've ever heard that the protagonist of a novel."
"Someone like me?"
Complete her words.
"Who were you planning to make the hero then? The tailor?"
Mocked, Madeline didn't know if it was a good idea to speak because Calhoun was a skilled person when it came to turning situations around, and he was the king, and that's why she had to be careful with her words. But no matter how careful she was, she stumbled in front of him. "I did not say anything."
"But you want him to be your savior from the big bad wolf, don't you?"
Calhoun scoffed, leaning back again. Swallowing softly, she said, "Would it be bad if he had good qualities?"
"I think you're misidentifying there, sweetheart."
Calhoun said.
"The good qualities you mentioned are only valid in books."
"It's good in my books," she confirmed, and he gave her a nod.
"But you live in my world, and these qualities won't help all the time."
Calhoun said, tilting his chin up slightly as he looked at her.
Let me tell you this, you may be the heroine and I may be the antagonist you're looking at, but these are the only main characters that will be there. There is no room for side characters like the unwanted tailor, an unnecessary person.
He said carefully. Madeline stared back at Calhoun and maintained eye contact. As much as she hated the fact that he forced her to stay in the castle, she couldn't deny that the words he said were rather interesting.
With the passage of time, you will find that I am not a person who wishes you evil, and I am not the villain.
Calhoun told her. Madeline thought to herself not to forget how he loved to frighten her, said the man who drank her blood. It was clear that Calhoun didn't care about people he wasn't interested in, and it was probably a good thing, because if he felt James was a threat then she wouldn't have to know what fate awaited him. Madeline then looked at her wrist, which looked normal except for the 2 dots due to Calhoun's fangs. She wanted to leave this room and return to see if she could find the actual culprit who tried to poison the king, but at the same time she had some questions that she was curious to get answers to. She told herself that this wasn't because she was interested in the king but simply because it had happened to her during her time here. Something made her think he knew the servant wasn't the real culprit. This was because the other prisoners left inside the cage who had rods pierced their skin and the servant she met were placed behind the cell. Who do you think wants to kill you? She asked him. Calhoun, who had his hand on the top of the sofa, was tracing random lines with his fingers as he stared at her with his intelligent eyes.
There are many. The person who holds the crown is always at risk of being killed.
To think of how everyone thought it was a shiny thing without realizing when the head they were holding would fall off. Madeline thought to herself, why are you keeping the man there then? Is it because no one has proven his innocence? She asked him.
Why do you want to interfere in something that does not concern you?
Answer her with a question. Women were usually creatures that liked to keep a low profile unless they were like his cousin Sophie, who was eyeing the throne. Is it wrong to worry about someone when it comes to their life? Calhoun replied.
You never said that. You claim to want a simple life, but here you are trying to get justice for the man by trying to find out who did this.
He raised his hand to his face and ran his fingers through his hair. Madeline didn't know what was going through Calhoun's mind. He knew and she knew him too, but he continued to keep the man in the cell. I'd like to leave, Madeline said, and he gave her a nod. She stood, bowed her head to see that smile on his lips, which she did not react to, and left the room without Calhoun, who did not bother to move from where he was sitting. After a while, Theodore entered the room looking for the king and bowed his head before entering the room.
How was your day, Theo?
Calhoun asked. So far so good, Theodore replied, noticing the smile on Calhoun's face. You seem to be in a good mood.
How is the research process going so far?
Theodore replied, we are looking at the maids. There is one who was a little more nervous than the others.
Find out who has gone to Yorkshire among my kind and generous relatives.
The smile widened on the king's lips. Calhoun was waiting for someone to fall into the trap and they happened to take the bait. I will, replied Theodore, but why Yorkshire? We thought she was from Somerset, asked the man.
Do you remember the bottle with the bulbous end that was delivered to Duke Caxton long ago? There is a very strange bottle whose maker was said to have died and someone else tried to replicate it, but it was not done because they did not know the technique of how to make it. She was from Yorkshire, the same place the present person comes from.
Calhoun explained.
The servant cannot do this alone and may be ordered by someone richer.
What do you suggest? Calhoun finally got up and met Theodore's eyes and said.
Pull out the involved maid and get the information about who gave her orders before tomorrow morning.